He vomited from seasickness. He cried. That was the last contact with land. They drank their own urine. But Cordoba had already given up. So, have you heard this story? I wonder. Imagine you were at home leaving on a normal fishing trip. Just the normal, going out to sea, catching fish. Nothing heroic, nothing dramatic, just another day at work. But then your engine dies, and then the radio goes silent, and you have a storm, and it keeps getting worse, and then suddenly you realize something terrifying. You're not just lost, you're disappearing. There's no GPS, there's no rescue, lone land in sight, just endless ocean, and a tiny boat drifting further away from the world every single hour. Now it sounds like a movie, right? Or it sounds like some impossible story. Just imagine surviving that. Not for a day, as we think, or a week, but this is true. 438 days. More than a year lost in the Pacific Ocean. Eating raw birds, drinking rainwater, watching ships go past you by without seeing you. And the worst part of the whole thing? The point, he wasn't even alone. But by the end of the story, he was. This is an amazing, unbelievable, true survival story of Salvador Alvarenga. And trust me, the most terrifying part about this story is not the storm. It's what loneliness did to his mind. You won't believe it. Hi everybody, welcome back to Daniel Tells Stories. And if you're with me when watching this channel, you know that we explore some of the most powerful real-life stories from around the world. Stories that are about kindness, stories about survival, stories about people who have faced impossible situations and yet somehow made it through. And if you've been here before, maybe you might remember the story about Julian Kopecki, the girl who fell from the sky, surprisingly, and somehow survived alone in the Amazon. And if you haven't watched it yet, please watch it on the Story on my channel. But today's story is so incredible. It's one of the most unbelievable survival stories ever recorded. Because it's not just about a man drifting at sea. This is a story about hunger, grief, loneliness, hallucinations, and the terrifying moment when a human being realized he may never see land again. And somehow, against every possible odd, can you believe this? One man refused to give up. You will be shocked. So let's get into it. So this story begins with Salvador Alvarenga. And I'm sorry if I said that name wrong. But he wasn't some famous explorer. No, really, he was an adventurer. He wasn't an adventurer chasing records either. This was just a fisherman. Originally from El Salvador, Salvador spent most of his life working along the Pacific coast of Mexico. And fishing was not a hobby to him, it was his survival. Those long nights on the water, those rough waves, as you know, if you've seen in movies, the unpredictable weather, that was all part of normal life. But in November 2012, something happened to him that turned that routine fishing trip into a complete nightmare. Salvador went out to his 25-foot open fishing boat. And with him came along a young crewmate named Esqual Cordoba, and he was only 22 years old. But here's that really interesting twist, as you see in the movies. Cordoba was not even supposed to be on that boat. Salvador's regular fishing partner couldn't make the trip that day, so Cordoba stepped in at the last minute as a random decision, as a last-minute replacement. But that tiny moment would change their lives forever. At first, everything just seemed normal. They had plenty of supplies, as you do when you go out to sea. Fuel, the fishing gear, the water, the ice for the catch, maybe a couple beers on the side. But then, as you could see out in the ocean, the storm arrived. And as storms do, they arrive really quickly, and the sky turned black. The waves exploded around the boat, and the rain slammed down like bullets. Water began flooding the deck, and both of the men started desperately throwing water overboard just to stop that boat from sinking. Can you imagine? Cordoba panicked. He vomited from seasickness. He cried out in fear. Of course, Salvador tried to stay calm, steering the boat to face the waves so they wouldn't flip over. But then, unfortunately, everything went wrong all at once. The engine failed, the GPS stopped working, the radio battery began dying. Suddenly, two fishermen were floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no way to find their way home. Salvador's one last radio call was to his boss. He asked for help, but they had no coordinates. They had no engine and no navigation. And then the radio died. That was the last contact with land. In one moment, they were still connected to the world, and then the next, they were gone. At first, of course, both men believed rescue would come, as you would. They dumped their entire catch of fish into the ocean to lighten the boat. Imagine throwing away all your work, all your income, and all your effort just to survive. But they did it. And days passed, and those days turned into weeks. And believe it or not, there was no rescue ships. There was no airplanes, and there was no signs of land. So their food ran out. And then their drinking water ran out. The sun burned their skin during the day, and the cold attacked them at night. Slowly, survival became more and more desperate. Salvador began catching fish with his bare hands. He would lean over the side of the boat and wait till the fish swam up in between his arms and then slamming them in together and then pulling them into the boat. So they ate raw fish, they ate raw turtle, seabirds, really anything they could catch. And when the rain came, they collected it in bottles, so they had drinking water. But when there was no rain, they had to do something a little bit worse. They drank their own urine. And then, unbelievably, even something worse happened after that. About 2 months at sea, Cordoba stopped fighting. He just stopped eating. He stopped trying to survive. Depression just consumed him. Salvador tried to encourage him, giving him small pieces of fish and trying to keep him alive. But Cordoba had already given up. One morning, he looked to Salvador and said that he was dying. And then, he was no longer alive. Right there in the boat. Now, Salvador wasn't just lost. He was completely alone. There was no voice, no conversation, and no witness. Just endless ocean in every direction. And for days, Salvador couldn't accept it. He talked to Cordoba's body. He would ask him questions, and he answered in Cordoba's voice, not because he was insane, but because loneliness had become unbearable. Eventually, he had to push the body over into the ocean. And when he finally did, he collapsed. That was his lowest point. Not the hunger, not the thirst, it was loneliness. Sometimes I think we all have that point too in our lives. But here's the really interesting thing about the story. Something strange happened inside Salvador's mind. Instead of giving up, he started creating a new world in his imagination. He imagined conversations with people, he imagined walking through towns, he imagined eating huge meals. Sometimes he even stood up in the boat and pretended he was taking a walk down the street. Of course, this sounds very strange, but actually that kept him sane, because silence is one of the most dangerous enemies of survival, and imagination became his companion. And another thing kept him alive too, his beliefs. His mother had taught him when he was very young. She told him that taking your own life means losing heaven forever, and that was a belief that became a line he refused to cross. So even when despair whispered and shouted in his ear, Salvador chose life. So as the story goes on, it's amazing. Over time, he adapted to the ocean like a scavenger. Every floating object mattered. Every bird landing on the boat was food. Every drop of rain was precious. One day he found a floating bag with rotten vegetables, gum, and spoiled milk. But instead of disgust, this felt like a miracle. He began tracking time by the moon. 15 lunar cycles passed. Can you believe it? 15 months drifting across the Pacific Ocean. And then, one day, something changed. He saw birds. And birds meant one thing: land. At first, he didn't trust it. He had had so many hallucinations that hope became dangerous. But this time, the island didn't disappear. A small green atoll rose out of the oceans like some miracle. Salvador cut loose the buoys, stabilizing the boat so it would move faster. And of course, that made the boat more dangerous, but speed mattered more than safety. So when he finally did reach shallow water, he jumped out and leaped out. After 438 days lost at sea, Salvador finally swam towards shore. A wave threw him onto the beach, and the first thing he did was grab a handful of sand. Not food, just sand. Because after more than a year in the ocean, touching land felt like touching life itself. Soon after, a couple living on the island found him wandering around weakly through the trees. He was a starving stranger who had somehow crossed, can you believe this? Crossed the Pacific Ocean. So when Salvador's story reached the world, many people obviously did not believe it. It sounded way too extreme. And even when I saw this, I couldn't believe it at first. It sounded like impossible. But the evidence told the truth. Ocean currents matched the journey. Witnesses had confirmed that he had left months earlier. His body carried the physical damage of long-term survival at sea. So that made the impossible real. But the story doesn't end with the rescue, because survival stories rarely end when someone reaches the land. Salvador came home alive, but of course the trauma stayed. For a long time he feared the ocean, and he struggled with sleep. He struggled with the guilt over Cordoba's death, and yet he kept moving forward. He even visited Cordoba's mother to tell her what happened. That tells you something about the kind of man that Salvador was. Because true strength isn't just surviving the ocean. No. True strength comes in sort of facing life afterwards. And maybe this is why this story hits so hard and is so impactful. Not because most of us will ever be lost at sea, but because most people don't know what it is to feel like to drift. To feel alone. To feel like you're impossible. You're in that middle of the storm and rescue may never come. Salvador's story reminds us of something truly impactful and powerful. You don't need to see the whole way out. Sometimes survival is just choosing life. For one more day, one more moment, one more breath, and then the next day, and the next day. Until finally, you reach your shore. If this story impacted like it did me, because I've been there before, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay tuned to Daniel Tells Stories for more powerful, real-life survival stories from around the world. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories are not fiction. They're real. And they prove that even when everything seems lost, the human spirit can still refuse to give up. If this story stayed with you for even a moment, don't just scroll away, because stories are like that. They're all about survival, about resilience, and about the strength that people find in the darkest moments, which is why this channel exists. If you want more stories like this of extreme survival or powerful acts of kindness from around the world, make sure you hit subscribe and like this video, and check out the other videos on the channel. Because the next story might not just shock you, it might also inspire you. See you next time.